In the grim darkness of the far future there is only war, and in this video we'll be trying to explain the phenomenon that is Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics. So in a nutshell, Warhammer 40K is a tabletop wargame made by Games Workshop. At the time of recording, I believe it is the biggest tabletop wargame in the world in terms of people who play it, and the amount of miniatures that are produced for it. Games Workshop do make other Warhammer game systems, but Warhammer 40K is currently the biggest, and it's set in a dystopian sci-fi far future setting. The core game in the hobby is generally played by assembling and painting plastic miniatures, and then commanding them against an opponent on a tabletop with some model scenery, and trying to outwit them with tactics and army building so that your army wins. To my mind, there are three main components to the Warhammer 40K hobby, although its incredibly rich and diverse lore and background means that it spills over into many other areas of culture. So let's talk about the lore of Warhammer 40K first. Around the 30th millennium AD, humanity had spread to the stars, but ultimately had been reduced to small warring factions, a mere shadow of its past glory. On the planet of Terra that was formerly known as Earth, one individual arose that was known only as the Emperor. He swiftly united the planet of Terra and declared a Great Crusade to liberate the galaxy and restore humanity's greatness to the stars. To aid him in this project, he created the Space Marines, transhuman super soldiers who are in every way superior to a normal man, bearing the finest arms and clad in the finest armour. These Space Marines are stronger and tougher, wield the mighty bolt gun, and are donned in suits of power armour, and are a fearsome force throughout the galaxy of 40K. To lead these legions of Space Marines, the Emperor created 20 Primarchs, who were as superior to a Space Marine as a Space Marine was to a normal person. These Primarchs considered themselves sons of the Emperor, and each commanded a Space Marine legion, whether that's Rabute Guilliman of the Ultramarines or Horus Lupercal of the Lunar Wolves. As the Crusade was nearing success, fully half of the remaining Space Marine legions turned traitor, turning from the Emperor's light to follow the foul gods of Chaos, Khorne, Nurgle, Slaanesh and Tzeentch. War Master Horus here was amongst them, and was finally defeated at the Siege of Terra by none other than the Emperor himself in single combat. Unfortunately, the Emperor was mortally wounded during this event, and his immobile body was taken and interred on the Golden Throne, an old technological apparatus that could keep him essentially in suspended animation on Terra, and he has remained there immobile and unable to communicate ever since. The traitor Space Marine legions were ultimately defeated and banished to the Eye of Terror, the largest warp storm in the galaxy, and for millennia there they remained under siege. Following this, Rabute Guilliman reorganised the Space Marines to fight as chapters, small 1,000-man formations, so that no one individual could ever command the power of a Space Marine legion again. In the millennia that followed this, mankind stagnated, near any technological innovation ceased, and the vast empire of the Imperium of Man, as it was now known, became plagued with bureaucracy, petty infighting, and dogmatic worship of the Emperor. One by one, the loyalist Primarchs died or disappeared, leaving only their Space Marine chapters to fend against the darkness. Fast forward to the 41st millennium, hence Warhammer 40K, and humanity is beset on all sides with horrors, as well as the continued incursion of the forces of chaos. There are many dangerous alien races to contend with, the Tyranids that devour all in their path, the warlike Orcs and their ramshackle, brutal technology and raw muscular might, the prideful Eldar seeking to reclaim a galaxy that's rightfully theirs, or having fallen to depravity and seeking only to prey upon mankind for the pain and suffering, the new and zealous Tau pushing their doctrine of a greater good that also falls in line with the rise of their technologically powerful empire, and the ancient evil stirring of the Necrons as this undead metallic race rises from their tomb worlds once more to purge the lesser races from the galaxy. The Space Marines are not alone in their fight against these horrors though. There are many other forces across the sprawling Imperium of Man, from the Custodes, the Emperor's Royal Guard, the Sisters of Battle, Defenders of the Faith, the Imperial Guard, the main army of the Emperor, brave men armed with nothing but lasguns and determination, the forces of the Machine God, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and the special forces of the Inquisition, the Death Watch to hunt aliens, and the Grey Knights who hunt demons. Towards the end of the 41st millennium, Abaddon the Despoiler led the forces of Chaos out of the Eye of Terror, breaching the Cadian Gate and destroying the fortress world of Cadia that kept the Eye of Terror in check, causing a great rift to open across the Imperium and the forces of Chaos to fall upon the Imperium of Man once more. In this dark time, the forces of the Eldar were able to restore the body of Rabute Guilliman to life once more, giving the Imperium of Man a returned Primarch who led his new augmented Primaris Space Marines on the Indomitus Crusade once more into the fight to try and push back the forces of chaos from a newly beset galaxy. Basically, the setting of Warhammer 40k is absolutely enormous. It's an enormous galaxy and not one that you'd like to live in, as the ruthless Imperium of man is very nearly as brutal as the forces that besiege it. The fact that the timescale and time span of Warhammer 40k is just so enormous means that there's near infinite scope for telling stories throughout the vast galaxy, and something that has certainly captured many people's imagination far beyond the miniature wargame. There are literally hundreds of books published by Black Library, including dozens documenting the cataclysmic events of the Horus Heresy, and there's a ton of fan-made art and stories told as well, such as the recent and incredibly well executed Astartes short videos that I highly recommend you check out if you want to see a squad of Space Marines in action. So that's the majority of the lore then, so let's take a look at the actual miniatures and where they come from. Generally, Games Workshop sells their models and painting supplies on high street shops or directly online, and they're often just called Warhammer Stores, and they're also stocked in other third-party retailers, other people who sell miniature wargames or hobbying supplies. This picture on the left is the current starter set for Warhammer 40k. It includes the rulebook and a force of new Space Marines and the foul Chaos Space Marines of the Death Guard for them to fight against. The miniatures don't come assembled or painted. You get these plastic sprues that you see on the right. Everything's sort of flat packed, so generally you clip them out with plastic shears and attach them together with plastic glue or super glue. It's worth noting that these kits can be very expensive, and is why Warhammer 40k has got a notorious reputation for being a bit pricey. It's true that once you have acquired the kits and made the models, then they're generally fairly proofed for the future, and you'll be able to keep on using the same miniatures if you want to, and overall for the amount of time that you might spend enjoying the hobby, I don't personally find the price too expensive. I have cherry-picked a couple of the absolute worst examples in terms of money for the amount of plastic kits that you get here though, such as the Space Marine tank on the left being £45 or $75 US, and this miniature orc artillery piece being £30. It's really not hard to see why Games Workshop gets a fair bit of flack for pricing their things a bit expensive, but I feel that they do have the rich background to draw on, and genuinely still make some of the best and most detailed kits around in the entire world, which is why they can get away from a business point of view for charging quite so much for their miniatures. In any case, the assembly and painting of the miniatures is certainly a hobby in its own right. There are plenty of people who are only really interested in the assembly and miniature painting, far more so than either the background or the game. You generally use some of the things on the left, the plastic shears and glue to assemble them together, and then the pots of paints to apply different colours and effect to the miniature. And with miniature painting there's a lot of emphasis on trying to make the model look more 3D, with highlights and shades to help give you the impression that light's falling on the miniature in a more realistic way. It really is an art form, and there are some incredibly talented people who paint miniatures. In addition to just basic assembly and painting, you can also make conversions, where you can combine bits from different kits to make something that's unique and your own. Say if you wanted to give your Space Marine a cool sword from a different kit, that would be an example of that. There's all sorts of painting techniques that you can master, such as the glow effects on the sword and helmet that this guy has achieved here. You can use magnets when you're assembling the models, so they can swap out different arms and war gear. And if you're very, very good, then you can enter them in competitions such as the Golden Demon competition, where the best miniature painters in the world compete with their entries to try and win the best painter in the world in certain categories. This version of Abaddon is one of those entries, and it's incredibly impressive. I think that the miniature painting and assembly really does add a dimension to the Warhammer 40k hobby. Even if you're not competing at these heady heights, you still have a really opportunity to make your army your own, either to try and represent a force from the history of 40k, or to make your own Space Marine chapter or Tyranid Hive Fleet, maybe with some backgrounds that you've thought up for them. Of course, it's a slow learning curve for painting, and I'd certainly not worry if your efforts don't match up to the pro painters that you see online. Now let's talk about the actual game that is Warhammer 40k on tabletop, which I have to say I really like, as I've dedicated an entire YouTube channel to it. So Warhammer 40k's rules are currently in their 8th edition. I think that the game is now more popular than it's actually ever been in the past, and when they revamped the rules, a whole load of players returned to the game, and it's attracted a whole lot more new lifeblood as well, so it's good to see it doing well. To play the game of 40k, you'll need a rulebook for the core rules, a tape measure and some dice. The tape measure is used to measure how far units can move, and check whether their guns are in range and things, and the dice are used for rolling to see if they hit the target, and if they do any damage once they have hit the target with their various attacks. Your opponent will then make armor saves to see if their troops' armor stops the attacks of yours, and if they fail then their troops are removed from the board and take no further part in the game. There's certainly a bit of a learning curve with all of these interactions, but I think it's easier to jump into 8th than it's been for quite a few editions of the game now. Generally games of Warhammer 40k are played on a tabletop as you see here, and they're generally played one-on-one. You'll set up your forces on one side of the tabletop, your opponent will set it up on the other as per the mission rules, and then the two armies will duke it out, with each army going as an entire turn at a time, to try and kill the opponent's forces off the tabletop and fight over certain objectives, which if you can capture them and hold them against the opponent, then that's also a way to win the game. Games are played basically wherever you have access to a game table. Plenty of people have them at home. The Games Workshop Warhammer stores themselves often have gaming space, although it does tend to be a little bit limited. In my experience, most games tend to be played at local gaming stores that aren't actually run by Games Workshop itself, as they tend to have a bit more of an emphasis on having gaming space available and having a community that operates around the shop. There's usually a decent amount of these about, and if you wanted to get into the hobby, then I'd recommend checking in with your local one. In my experience, they're filled with very friendly people who are absolutely happy to show people the ropes if they want to try and give the game a go. You can also play games at tournaments or organised events. Tournaments tend to be a bit more competitive and trying to use all of the rules that you can to win where possible. But you can also get more narrative events as well, as people play to decide the outcome of a campaign or to try and recreate a famous battle from 40k's history. The games themselves usually tend to last between 2 or 3 hours, it depends exactly how many miniatures you're using. Most games will essentially have a points limit, where you and your opponent agree to how big a game you want to play, and then that determines how many miniatures you can take in your army. There can be many different forms of playing 40k. You can play it just very casually with a couple of friends and a few beers, just using the miniatures that you have and not worrying too much about exactly who wins. You can go for a bit more of an involved narrative game, where one person creates a storyline and tries to put the battles into some sort of wider context, such as a campaign where the Space Marines and the Eldar are fighting over a ruined city, where one battle's events can have effect on the next. Or you can go for the more competitive or matched play, which is a little bit more formal, and it's often more focused on playing at a set points level and trying to outwit and win the missions against your opponent's army, in a sort of a bit like a wargame chess sort of affair. I personally find the competitive game really interesting. Warhammer's just got a lot of different ways that you can potentially win. The factions are pretty varied and have their different playstyles, so I do really find it interesting when they're competing against each other. And the skill comes both from picking the army that you're going to be using in the game, choosing the strongest things and combinations that will best face up against the things that you're likely to be fighting, and then actually making clever tactical decisions in-game, which can be everything from the grand strategy of what objectives you're going to go for, and how your army is going to move as a battle line compared with individual squad and miniature based tactics to try and maximise the use of cover and make clever moves in close combat charges and things. Aside from just random one-on-one games, many stores also run weekly or monthly leagues where you'll either be drawn against an opponent or people make their own games and report their results, and there can be a bit of friendly competition as to trying to reach the top of that. And of course, as I mentioned, tournaments, which are like you can see down in the picture below here, where you get a whole ton of people together and they play off against each other, trying to reach the top spot in theory, but it doesn't really matter too much if you don't. You still get to have a good day with socialising with people and seeing a ton of cool and interesting armies on the table. I find the gaming side of Warhammer a really good way to meet new people, as it's a fairly one-on-one interaction most of the time. It gives you a lot of time for chatting and catching up, and putting you in a situation where you might get to know people a bit faster than you would have done otherwise. In my experience, gaming clubs tend to attract really nice groups of people, brought together by a shared hobby. Of course, there are more areas that I haven't touched on in Warhammer 40k, such as the computer games, such as their popular Dawn of War series, and the various other games that Games Workshop make that are set in the same setting, such as Necromunda, a more gang-based street warfare sort of game, or other ones like Blackstone Fortress, Aeronautica Imperialis, or Kill Team. Overall, it's a big and complex hobby, and I can understand how it might not be the most clear for people outside it, so I hope this video has helped clear some things up for some people. If you are interested in learning more, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I mainly focus on the tactics of actually playing the game, though I do go into other topics. And the channel also has a Discord server that's down in the description below, which is free to use, and it's basically just a chat room type thing, with sections for all of the various main aspects of 40k, whether tactics, modelling and painting, or just generally talking about the lore is your thing. So feel free to check that out if that interests you. There's a lot of very good and very intelligent people on there. Additionally, if you'd like to support the channel, I do have a Patreon page, which is also down in the video's description. Making all of these videos will take a fair bit of time, and the support on Patreon is what makes it possible. And in addition to that, you do get other things such as access to new videos early, voting on the future of the channel, and also the occasional prize draw. A massive thank you to my current Patreons for making this all possible, and please give it a look if you are enjoying my content. In any case, thanks very much for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.